that birth to like that window, that rapid firing of those neurons and those brain cells. And so when we say environment matters, when we say what's going on in the environment matters, it really does. So we're very much needed. But yet and still the child care field in itself does not get the recognition that's honestly deserving.
Welcome to Waging Love, a podcast exploring early care and education, told through conversation, grounded in research. What you hear here is not opinion. It is record, data, history, lived experience studied, documented, and repeated across generations. These stories are not exceptions. They are patterns. I'm Tim Harper, and this is Waging Love.
Money and caring. I chose caring a long time ago.
Before we talk about early care and education in the United States, we need to tell the truth about what this system is. It was not built because the country valued children. It was built because the country needed care and did not want to pay for it. Early care and education in the United States did not emerge from generosity, foresight, or shared responsibility. It emerged from extraction, from removal, from exploitation carefully disguised as necessity. And if that sounds too sharp, here's the test. Look at who has always been closest to children's bodies and furthest from decision-making power. That distance isn't accidental, it's design. A quick baseline, before we go demographic by demographic. The early educator workforce in the United States is large and chronically underprotected. Using the most consistent national workforce tables available for this project, the estimated early educator workforce is about 1,776,300 people. In that estimate, the workforce is about 55.6% white, about 21.4% Latina, about 14.8% Black, about 4.4% Asian, about 0.4% American Indian or Alaska Native, roughly 7,500 educators in a workforce of nearly 1.8 million, and about 3.0% multiracial. Those numbers are not just demographics. They are a map of where the system pulls labor and where it pushes risk. So in this episode, we're going to move through these positions in the system, section by section. We begin where the story of U.S. early care really begins, with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and relating through kinship, land, and responsibility. In Episode 1, we named the foundation, Care Before the System, and we named its scale, millions of Indigenous women carrying education through kinship, land, and language, and generations of Black women compelled to teach and care under slavery. This section will not retell that story as myth or metaphor. The land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness. Paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world, receiving the gifts with open eyes and open heart. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Citizen Potawatomi Nation, Braiding Sweetgrass. To understand early care and education in the United States, we have to begin with Indigenous women. Not because Indigenous women make up a large portion of the workforce today, but because Indigenous systems of care were the first to be targeted, dismantled, and removed. Before the United States existed, Indigenous nations across what is now called North America held deep, intentional systems of care, education, and child-rearing. These systems were not informal or secondary. They were central to governance, community survival, and continuity across generations. Children were raised collectively within extended kinship networks. They learned through observation, participation, storytelling, ceremony, and responsibility to land and community. Care was not separated from education. Education was not separated from culture, and children were not separated from their people. These systems did not require institutions in the Western sense, because they were institutions, grounded in Indigenous law, cosmology, language, and collective responsibility. It is important to be precise here. Indigenous systems of care and education were not universally organized through rigid gender binaries or patriarchal hierarchies in the way European colonial systems were. Responsibility for teaching and caregiving often flowed through kinship, clan relationships, age, spiritual role, seasonal need, and knowledge. Authority was contextual and relational, rather than hierarchical. Roles shifted across time and circumstance. This section centers Indigenous women not because Indigenous education was exclusively women's work, but because colonial systems forcibly regendered care, and because today, nearly all formal early care and education labor is performed by women. In the 15th century, at the beginning of what will become, and what is historically, a genocide of Indigenous peoples, European expansion is not simply exploration. It is a project of domination, a project that requires land, and requires a story that makes taking land feel lawful, holy, inevitable. By the mid-1400s and late 1400s, that story is already being written into doctrine. Papal bulls like Dum Diversis and Inter Cetera sit inside the lineage that becomes known as the Doctrine of Discovery, an authority claim that framed non-Christian lands as available to Christian empire, and non-Christian peoples as subordinate within that order. That matters because it doesn't just authorize conquest, it authorizes erasure. It authorizes the idea that Indigenous governance does not count as governance, that Indigenous law does not count as law, and that Indigenous kinship, how children learn who they are and what they owe their people, can be overwritten. And because children are how a people continues, how language, governance, and responsibility are carried forward, children become a target early. Not always through a single school policy yet, but through the steady building of an assumption that Indigenous children can be remade and Indigenous futures can be reassigned. By the early 16th century, colonization becomes procedure. Violence has paperwork. It has scripts. It has a legal performance that pretends conquest is consent. In 1513, Spain uses the requerimiento, a declaration read to Indigenous peoples demanding acceptance of Spanish rule and Christian preaching, with refusal used to justify war, enslavement, and death. That is not a footnote. That is a model. Domination presented as choice, and punishment presented as their fault. Around the same period, Spain codifies forced labor and Christian instruction through colonial systems like the encomienda, and through early regulations like the laws of Burgos, which, even while claiming Indigenous people were free, organized their lives around extraction and conversion. So when we later arrive at education, we are not arriving at a neutral idea. We are arriving at a tool, built inside conquest. And this is where I want to name genocide clearly. Not as metaphor, as method. Genocide is not only mass death. It is the intentional destruction of a people's ability to continue as themselves, through the dismantling of language, kinship, governance, and the conditions that make a community continuous. International law even names one specific act, the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. By the 17th century, as European settlements expand and harden into colonies, Indigenous caregiving systems are increasingly treated as sites to discipline, reform, and replace. Care is not disrupted as an unintended consequence of expansion. It is deliberately targeted, because care is where identity is formed, where values are practiced, and where a people reproduces itself across generations. As settler colonialism intensifies through the 18th and 19th centuries, Indigenous family structures become a primary focus of state intervention. Removal, military violence, and land theft fracture communities long before formal schooling systems were imposed. And then, by the early 19th century, the U.S. begins to formalize what colonization has been doing for centuries. In 1819, Congress passes the Civilization Fund Act, funding education and civilization efforts, often through church and missionary organizations. Assimilation becomes budgeted. It becomes a line item. From there, the logic accelerates into a system that directly targets children at scale. Federal Indian boarding schools operate as an assimilation project aimed at stripping Indigenous children of language, culture, and ties to family and community, an approach later embodied by institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded 1879, the first federal off-reservation boarding school. And this is not ancient history. The U.S. Department of the Interior's Boarding School Initiative documents a federal system spanning 1819 to 1969, identifying hundreds of schools and burial sites tied to the system. So when we talk about Indigenous women and care, this is why. Because the colonial state did not just steal land, it attacked the relational infrastructure that makes land more than property. Family, governance, language, and the ways children are raised into belonging. This project accelerated dramatically after the Civil War. In the late 19th century, the United States expanded a network of Indian boarding schools designed to forcibly remove Indigenous children from their families and communities. These schools were not designed to educate Indigenous children as Indigenous people. They were designed to eliminate Indigenous identity. Children were taken, often by force, hundreds of miles from home. Their hair was cut, their languages were forbidden, their names were changed. Indigenous caregiving practices were framed as backward, dangerous, or uncivilized. Indigenous women, as primary caregivers, teachers, and knowledge holders within their communities, were directly targeted by these policies. Their authority over children was undermined. Their knowledge of care was criminalized. Their role in sustaining community life was intentionally disrupted. This was not an unintended consequence of schooling. It was the purpose. This history matters because it explains why Indigenous women do not appear in early care and education in the same way as other groups. The formal early care and education system in the United States did not develop by incorporating Indigenous care traditions. It developed after those traditions were systematically dismantled. As Indigenous caregiving systems were destroyed, the state did not invite Indigenous women into leadership roles within emerging early childhood institutions. Instead, Indigenous women were often excluded altogether from formal education systems and from the growing care economy. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Indigenous women's labor was redirected into domestic service in white households, agricultural labor, or informal community-based care, care that went unrecognized, unsupported, and frequently criminalized. At the same time, Indigenous children were subjected to continued state control through boarding schools and later through public schooling systems that erased Indigenous knowledge and authority. This is the first major rupture in the story of early care and education. Indigenous care was not underpaid. It was removed. The 20th century did not bring repair. Although the federal Indian boarding school system formally declined after the Second World War, assimilation policies persisted through other means. The Indigenous children were disproportionately removed from their families through state and county child welfare systems, particularly during the mid-20th century, in what scholars now refer to as the Indian adoption era. From the 1950s through the 1970s, thousands of Indigenous children were placed in non-Indigenous foster and adoptive homes. This continued the same logic that had governed boarding schools. Indigenous families were framed as incapable of providing appropriate care, while the state asserted authority over Indigenous childhood. The passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 was a direct response to this crisis. The law acknowledged that the removal of Indigenous children from their families was systemic, not incidental, and affirmed the right of tribal nations to maintain authority over child welfare decisions involving their children. But the Indian Child Welfare Act did not restore what had been taken. It did not undo generations of separation, language loss, or the dismantling of Indigenous caregiving systems. It attempted to slow an ongoing process of erasure, rather than repair the damage already done. As early care and education expanded in the latter half of the 20th century, through federally funded preschool programs, state pre-kindergarten initiatives, and private child care centers, Indigenous women remained largely absent from the formal system. This absence is often misinterpreted as lack of participation. It is not. It is the outcome of a system that was built after Indigenous care was destroyed, not alongside it. Some tribal early childhood programs emerged as sites of resistance and cultural reclamation, particularly within tribally operated preschool programs and language revitalization efforts. These programs worked to restore Indigenous pedagogy, relational learning, and community authority. But even these efforts were forced to operate within federal funding structures, Western assessment models, and accountability systems that constrained tribal sovereignty. Indigenous knowledge was welcomed as enrichment. Indigenous authority was not. There is another layer to this history that often goes unnamed, but it matters deeply for how early care and education understands itself today. Even as Indigenous care systems were being dismantled, many of the principles that guided those systems did not disappear. They were taken. As Euro-American early childhood philosophy began to articulate ideas like child-led learning, experiential education, observation-based assessment, mixed age groupings, learning through play, connection to nature, and the importance of community and relationship, these ideas were presented as innovations. They were framed as discoveries. They were attributed to white European and Euro-American thinkers, psychologists, and pedagogues. But many of these concepts were already embedded in Indigenous systems of care and education, long before they were named by Western theory. What happened instead of recognition was translation without attribution. Indigenous knowledge was stripped of context, separated from land and sovereignty, and reintroduced through Euro-American frameworks that made it legible to white institutions. Once detached from Indigenous peoples, these ideas could be celebrated, funded, and institutionalized. This is another form of erasure. Indigenous care was first targeted for destruction. Then, fragments of that care were selectively absorbed into dominant early childhood philosophies, without acknowledging their origins, without returning authority, and without restoring Indigenous control over how children are raised and educated. Today, Indigenous women appear in national early care and education datasets as about 0.4%. Approximately 7,500 early educators, in a 2022 ACS-based estimate of the workforce. This figure reflects chronic undercounting, misclassification, and the exclusion of tribal systems from national data collection. It tells us that early care and education in the United States is built on a foundation of erasure, an erasure that shaped what kinds of care were considered legitimate, what kinds of knowledge were valued, and who was allowed to define education itself. This is the first act in the construction of the system, and it sets the stage for what came next. Because once Indigenous care systems were dismantled, the United States did not abandon care. It turned elsewhere for it. That labor came from Black women. Before we move there, we need to pause and name something else. Indigenous women did not disappear after removal. They continued to teach. They continued to build. They continued to shape education, often outside the system, often in resistance to it. Those continuities, and the Indigenous-led institutions that carry them forward, are where we turn next. Children were taken, often by force, hundreds of miles from home. Their hair was cut. Their languages were forbidden. Their names were changed. Indigenous caregiving practices were framed as backward, dangerous, or uncivilized. Indigenous women, as primary caregivers, teachers, and knowledge holders within their communities, were directly targeted by these policies. Their authority over children was undermined. Their knowledge of care was criminalized. Their role in sustaining community life was intentionally disrupted. This was not an unintended consequence of schooling. It was the purpose. This history matters because it explains why Indigenous women do not appear in early care and education in the same way as other groups. The formal early care and education system in the United States did not develop by incorporating Indigenous care traditions. It developed after those traditions were systematically dismantled. As Indigenous caregiving systems were destroyed, the state did not invite Indigenous women into leadership roles within emerging early childhood institutions. Instead, Indigenous women were often excluded altogether from formal education systems and from the growing care economy. My education has not come from tests and term papers. It has come from conversations in and with the land. Leanne Batasamosake Simpson, Michi Sagi Gnishnabeg. Land as Pedagogy. When Indigenous women were pushed out of state-sanctioned systems of education, they did not wait to be reintegrated. They built. They built schools, programs, institutes, and universities that answered to Indigenous communities rather than colonial standards. They built early childhood programs where language, land, and kinship were not supplemental, but foundational. They built institutions that treated education not as workforce preparation, but as cultural survival and governance. This is where Indigenous leadership in early care and education becomes unmistakable, not in spite of exclusion, but because of it. One of the clearest examples of this institutional continuity is Diné College, the first tribally controlled college in the United States. Established to serve the Diné Nation, Diné College grounds education in Diné philosophy, language, and relational accountability. Teaching is not abstracted from land or community. Knowledge is not separated from responsibility. For early childhood education, this matters deeply. Teacher preparation at Diné College does not treat Indigenous knowledge as cultural enrichment layered on to Western frameworks. It treats Diné ways of knowing as the foundation of pedagogy itself. Children are understood as relational beings, accountable to family, community, land, and future generations. Education is inseparable from sovereignty. This model directly challenges dominant early care and education structures, which often require Indigenous educators to translate their knowledge into forms legible to external systems. At Diné College, no such translation is required. Authority remains with the community. This is not an isolated example. Across the United States, Indigenous women have been central to building institutions focused on language revitalization, because language is education, and education is survival. The Indigenous Language Institute has played a key role in supporting Indigenous communities as they reclaim, restore, and sustain their languages. Founded to strengthen Indigenous language efforts through training, materials development, and technical support, the Institute works across tribal communities to help build the conditions necessary for language to live again, not as archival record, but as daily practice. What matters here is not just the existence of language programs, but how they operate. Language revitalization work led by Indigenous women does not treat language as a subject. It treats language as a living system embedded in early childhood, family life, ceremony, and governance. Teaching a child language is inseparable from teaching responsibility, relationship, and belonging. This understanding has traveled. Indigenous communities have learned from one another, shared models, adapted approaches, and built networks that cross geography while remaining rooted in place. One of the most influential examples of this is the Hawaiian language revitalization movement. The work of Aha Punana Leo began with early childhood language nests designed to restore Hawaiian as a living language after decades of state suppression. What started with young children expanded into a full immersion pathway, reshaping education policy across Hawaii and demonstrating what becomes possible when language reclamation begins in early childhood. This work has long been recognized by Indigenous educators elsewhere, not as a program to copy, but as a model of what it looks like when communities assert authority over education rather than asking for inclusion. The relationship between Hawaiian language revitalization efforts and continental Indigenous language work is not incidental. Indigenous women, educators, and scholars have been in conversation for decades, sharing strategies, supporting one another's efforts, and refining approaches to immersion, intergenerational transmission, and community-based governance. What connects these efforts is not uniformity, but principle. Education is accountable to community, not compliance. Language is central, not decorative. Early childhood is foundational, not preparatory. These institutions do not exist to feed the early care and education system as it currently operates. They exist to demonstrate that another way of organizing care is possible. This is where mainstream early care and education reform often falters. The field is eager to adopt the language of relationship, whole child development, culturally sustaining practice, relational pedagogy, without adopting the structures that make those ideas real. Indigenous-led institutions reveal the gap between rhetoric and reality. Land-based learning without land. Language inclusion without language authority. Cultural responsiveness without governance. Indigenous women working in these institutions are not asking to be recognized as contributors to the existing system. They are showing, in real time, what it looks like to build something else. And this work does not only benefit Indigenous children. It challenges the entire field to confront a foundational question. Is early care and education about managing children within existing systems, or about sustaining communities across generations? Indigenous women have already answered that question. Through Diné College, through language revitalization institutes, through Hawaiian language immersion pathways, through countless community-based programs that never make national datasets, Indigenous women are shaping the future of early care and education without waiting for permission. This is not innovation at the margins. It is leadership at the center. And it clarifies something essential as we move forward in this episode. If Indigenous care was removed first, and Indigenous women were forced to build outside the system, then what followed was not coincidence. Once Indigenous systems were dismantled, the United States turned elsewhere for care labor, extracting it, regulating it, and racializing it in new ways. That next shift did not erase Indigenous leadership. It layered another form of exploitation on top of it. The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. Bell hooks, teaching to transgress, education as the practice of freedom. With Indigenous care systems forcibly dismantled and removed, the United States did not abandon care. It turned elsewhere for it. That labor came from Black women. Early care and education in the United States was not built in isolation. It emerged through a sequence of deliberate decisions and violences. First, the erasure of Indigenous systems of care, and then the forced and later coerced extraction of Black women's caregiving labor. This sequence matters because it explains not only how the system was built, but why it continues to operate the way it does. From the 17th century through the formal abolition of slavery in 1865, enslaved Black women were required to provide intimate, daily care for white children. They fed them, bathed them, soothed them, monitored their behavior, taught them early skills, and maintained the domestic environments that allowed white households and white childhood to function. Enslaved Black women were not only expected to care for white children, they were expected to sustain them, sometimes through the most intimate labor possible. Wet nursing made the extraction literal. Black women's bodies were compelled to nourish white infancy, while their own children were often deprived, separated, or placed at risk. This is one of the clearest examples of how early care in the United States was built through coerced intimacy. Care under conditions where consent did not exist, and where the caregiver's humanity was structurally irrelevant. That history matters because the field still carries its residue. The assumption that good care is selfless, that the caregiver should disappear, that the labor is emotional, natural, and infinite, rather than skilled, protected, and compensated. At the same time, enslaved Black women were systematically denied the right to care for their own children, whose lives were subject to sale, separation, and violence. Family separation was not a side effect of slavery. It was a governance strategy. When children can be sold, the family cannot stabilize. When parenting can be interrupted at any moment, care becomes conditional. And when care is conditional, the system gets what it wants: labor without leverage. This is why it is not enough to say that Black women did care work. Black women did care work while the state and the economy repeatedly destabilized Black family life, turning caregiving into something done under threat, under constraint, and under constant exposure to loss. This was not incidental to slavery. It was foundational. After emancipation, Black women carried that same caregiving capacity into a new terrain, one where freedom existed on paper, but protection did not. Black communities built schools, churches, and mutual aid networks as survival infrastructure. Black women taught, organized, and fundraised. They created spaces where children could learn under constant threat of white violence and state neglect. These were not simply community supports. They were parallel institutions, built in response to the fact that the state refused to guarantee safety, education, or child well-being. Black women organized food, clothing, shelter, health support, and schooling because children could not wait for policy. They created environments of learning inside churches, clubs, and living rooms. They formed systems of accountability when public systems were hostile or absent. This is an early blueprint of what Black women still do in early care and education now, building stability inside instability, creating safety inside surveillance, producing learning even when the institution refuses to fully invest in the conditions that make learning possible. In other words, Black women were not only a labor source for other people's households, they were architects of community education. As the country moved into the Jim Crow era, segregation and exclusion narrowed the paid labor available to Black women, pushing many into domestic service and informal care work. That channeling wasn't accidental. It was how the economy solved the demand for care without ever having to treat care as public responsibility. Caregiving labor performed by Black women made white family life, white childhood, and the broader economy possible, while Black family life was deliberately destabilized. Care was extracted under force, surveillance, and threat. It was never recognized as skilled labor. It was treated as something Black women were expected to give endlessly, without protection. When slavery formally ended in 1865, this structure did not disappear. It adapted. During Reconstruction and into the late 19th century, Black women were pushed into domestic and caregiving roles through a combination of economic coercion, racial terror, and legal exclusion. Caregiving labor performed by Black women was formally positioned outside the boundaries of real work. It was excluded from the protections that defined legitimacy, stability, and value. And as early care and education began to take shape as a distinct field, it inherited this structure rather than correcting it. As the 20th century progressed, especially from the 1940s through the 1960s, the United States underwent major economic and social shifts. Manufacturing expanded. Labor unions gained strength in many sectors. Public schooling became more formalized. At the same time, more white women entered the paid workforce, increasing demand for childcare outside the home. But access to opportunity was not evenly distributed. Because Black women's care labor has been framed as natural rather than skilled, their expertise is often undervalued or dismissed. Part of what made this extraction socially acceptable was narrative. The mammy myth was not harmless imagery. It was an ideological tool designed to make Black women's devotion to white children appear natural, cheerful, and apolitical. It reframed coerced labor as affection. It made exploitation look like loyalty. And it trained the public to see Black women's caregiving as something they are, not something they do. And the myth had a double edge. It romanticized Black care when it served whiteness, and criminalized Black care when it served Black freedom. This is part of why Black women can be trusted with everyone's children, and still be denied authority, safety, and institutional power. Black women in early care and education are frequently expected to stabilize classrooms, manage crises, support families, mentor colleagues, and absorb institutional stress, often without recognition, authority, or protection. The policing of Black women's authority doesn't only show up in adult relationships. It shows up in how institutions define behavior, safety, and risk. Early childhood spaces can become miniature surveillance systems, where documentation, tone policies, compliance rubrics, and parent-facing performance expectations accumulate around educators who are already overexposed to scrutiny. And because Black women are often positioned as stabilizers, they can become the first to be blamed when the system destabilizes. When a classroom is under-resourced, the failure is managerial. But the consequence often lands on the person closest to children's bodies, the Black woman educator expected to absorb the impossible. From the early 20th century to the present, Black women's labor has been subject to surveillance of tone, demeanor, and emotional expression. Advocacy can be read as aggression. Leadership can be framed as threat. Emotional response to harm can be treated as unprofessional, rather than as evidence of systemic failure. These patterns are not anecdotal. They are structural continuations of a system that extracts Black women's care while denying Black women power. This history explains a central contradiction in early care and education today. Black women are often essential to the daily functioning of programs, especially those serving marginalized communities. They are frequently the educators who remain when funding is unstable, staffing is thin, and expectations are high. And yet, they are often among the most vulnerable to discipline, dismissal, and burnout. This is not because Black women lack commitment. It is because the system has been built to rely on their endurance. That history did not stop shaping the field. It reorganized itself. Today, Black women make up about 14.8%, approximately 263,500 early educators, in a 2022 ACS-based estimate of the early care and education workforce nationwide. They remain disproportionately concentrated in under-resourced settings. But alongside this concentration of labor is another reality that must be named. Black women are also among the primary maintainers of quality in early care and education. Just as Indigenous women built sovereign systems outside state control after removal, Black women have built systems within and alongside formal institutions to protect children, sustain pedagogy, and prevent collapse when the system fails to do so. This leadership is visible in Black-led organizations such as the National Black Child Development Institute, which has for decades centered Black children, families, and educators in early development policy and practice. It is visible in networks of Black family childcare providers who operate relational, culturally affirming environments that many children rely on as their first educational spaces. It is visible in informal professional learning communities, mentorship networks, and organizing efforts that exist outside credential pipelines, but are essential to pedagogy and retention. Black women routinely translate policy mandates into practices that actually serve children. They soften punitive discipline. They mediate between families and institutions that do not listen. They create emotional safety in environments structured around surveillance. This translation is labor. Intellectual labor, emotional labor, pedagogical labor, and it is rarely named as leadership. Instead, Black women's ability to sustain quality under constraint is often treated as evidence that the system works, rather than evidence of how much the system relies on unprotected labor. This becomes especially clear during moments of crisis. When programs face staffing shortages, funding instability, or community trauma, Black women are often the ones who remain. They cover classrooms, they mentor new staff, they absorb additional emotional labor so children are protected from institutional failure. This endurance is often praised, but praise without protection is extraction by another name. The field often uses love as a management strategy. Calling the work a calling can sound like respect, but function like wage suppression. When care is framed as moral, refusal becomes shameful. When endurance is framed as virtue, harm becomes invisible. And when Black women have historically been positioned as the ones who hold it down, the system learns to interpret their survival as proof that conditions are acceptable. This is one of the most durable technologies of extraction in early care and education. Not just low pay, but a moral story that makes low pay feel inevitable. There is another form of Black women's leadership in early care and education that must be named, not only in how the work is done, but in how the field has been understood. Black women have also been among the clearest thinkers exposing what this system is and why it operates the way it does. One important example is Mary Pauper, a historical exploration of early care and education compensation, policy, and solutions, a collective analysis authored by Chrishana Lloyd, Juliana Carlson, Hannah Barnett, Sarah Shaw, and Deja Logan. This work traces how early care and education has been shaped by racism, sexism, and the long expectation that women, especially Black women, will accept poverty wages in the name of care. What Mary Pauper makes visible is not just a history of low compensation, but a logic, a system that relies on moral language, calling, passion, love for children, to justify economic exploitation, and that treats endurance as evidence of commitment rather than as a signal of harm. Because it helps name why so many reform efforts stall, why wage increases without power redistribution fall short, and why Black women's endurance continues to be treated as a renewable resource. That intellectual labor is not separate from the field. It is central to understanding it. There is also a critical layer of data infrastructure that Black women have helped make visible. Early care and education was built to rely on care labor without fully accounting for it. For decades, data on wages, working conditions, racial composition, and turnover was fragmented or absent. Institutions such as the Berkeley Center for the Study of Childcare Employment have fundamentally reshaped what the field can see by assembling workforce data that makes structural inequity undeniable. In a system built not to track care labor carefully, producing rigorous data is itself a form of intervention. Here, data becomes part of care infrastructure. Understanding Black women's role in early care and education requires holding both truths at once. A Black feminist lens makes something plain. Care is not only service. Care is labor. Care is strategy. Care is a site of power, because it is where survival is organized and where futures are shaped. This matters for early care and education because the field often separates practice from theory. But Black women have produced theory through practice, naming what the system is, how it extracts, and what repair would actually require. Not just better wages, but redistributed decision-making power. Black care was extracted. Black leadership sustains quality anyway. That dual role, indispensable yet unprotected, is not coincidental. It is foundational, and it prepares us for what comes next. As early care and education expanded further in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the system increasingly relied on Latina women navigating immigration precarity and language exclusion to fill gaps created by underfunding and turnover. That shift did not replace Black women's role. It layered another form of extraction onto the same structure. Understanding Black women's position, historically and now, allows us to see that layering clearly. And this is the point of ending here. Because the story of Black women in early care and education is not only a history of harm, it is a map of the system. A system that learns how to keep care cheap by keeping caregivers structurally vulnerable. A system that praises endurance while withholding protection. A system that relies on Black women to stabilize what it refuses to fund. And then polices Black women's authority when they name what is happening. The system did not move on from Black women. It added layers. It kept the same logic, extraction without power, and adapted the mechanism to the next era. After slavery, vulnerability was produced through legal exclusion and racial terror. In the modern era, vulnerability is also produced through documentation status, immigration enforcement, and language governance, through a form of conditional belonging that makes refusal risky and silence strategic. So when we turn to Latina women, we are not turning to a separate story. We are turning to the next layer of the same structure. As early care and education expanded further in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, under marketization, privatization, and chronic underfunding, the system increasingly relied on Latina women to fill the gaps. Not because the work became easier, but because precarity could be leveraged. Immigration status becomes a labor policy. Language becomes a gate, and the promise of belonging becomes conditional, offered in exchange for availability, flexibility, and low wages. That is the hinge, not replacement, accumulation. And that is where we go next. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Gloria Anzaldúa, Borderlands / La Frontera. Latina women's relationship to early care and education in the United States cannot be understood through a single story. It is shaped by multiple histories unfolding at the same time. Histories of indigenous continuity, colonial displacement, labor migration, and immigration policy layered on top of one another. Latina women are not newcomers to this land. Many are indigenous to it. Others arrived through migration shaped by United States political and economic intervention across Latin America. Many carry both histories at once. Indigenous ancestry rooted in place, alongside movement forced or constrained by borders that were imposed long after their communities existed. To understand why Latina women make up roughly 1 in 5, about 21.4%, of the early care and education workforce today, we have to understand how these histories converged and how the system learned to govern Latina labor through precarity, gratitude, and endurance. Long before the United States existed, indigenous peoples across what are now called the Southwest, California, Texas, Florida, and much of the Americas held sophisticated systems of care, education, and child rearing. These systems were relational, land-based, and community-governed. Children learned through participation, observation, storytelling, and responsibility to family and place. Colonization did not erase these systems all at once. It layered violence on top of them. Beginning in the 16th century, Spanish colonization disrupted indigenous care through mission systems, forced labor, and religious control. Indigenous caregiving practices were reframed as inferior or immoral. Authority over children was relocated away from families and communities and toward colonial institutions. Later, United States expansion compounded this disruption. After the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, borders were redrawn without moving people. Indigenous and mestiza communities were suddenly rendered foreigners on land they had always inhabited. This matters for early care and education because it complicates the dominant narrative of migration. Many Latino women in the United States are not immigrants in the way policy discourse assumes. They are indigenous people whose relationship to land predates the nation-state. And yet, their caregiving knowledge, like that of other indigenous women, was devalued, criminalized, or erased as United States institutions imposed Western educational models and racial hierarchies. At the same time, United States economic expansion actively relied on Latina labor. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexican and Mexican-American women were drawn into domestic service, agricultural labor, and informal caregiving roles. These jobs were low-paid, unstable, and largely unregulated. Care work became one of the few sectors where Latina women could find employment without formal credentials or English fluency. This reliance intensified during periods of labor shortage.
During the Second World War, the United States government implemented the Bracero program, which brought millions of Mexican men into the country as temporary agricultural workers. While the program formally targeted men, it reshaped family structures and labor markets in ways that increased demand for Latina women's caregiving labor, both within households and in community-based childcare arrangements. As industrial and agricultural labor shifted, Latina women increasingly filled roles caring for children so others could work. By the mid-20th century, care work had become a central entry point into the United States labor market for Latina women, particularly in urban centers and agricultural regions. This pattern did not emerge because care work matched Latina women's preferences or skills in any essential way. It emerged because care work was underpaid, underregulated, and flexible enough to absorb workers with limited legal or economic protection. Immigration policy after 1965 deepened this pattern. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 reshaped migration flows from Latin America, while simultaneously creating new forms of legal precarity. Many Latina women enter the United States through family-based migration, undocumented migration, or temporary legal statuses that restricted access to formal employment and labor protections. Early care and education became one of the few sectors where Latina women could find work, regardless of legal status. Family childcare homes, community-based programs, and informal caregiving arrangements offered flexibility and access, but little protection. This was not a fluke. When a labor sector is underregulated and undervalued, it becomes a site where legal precarity can be exploited. Latina women's caregiving labor was essential to keeping households, communities, and eventually formal childcare systems running, while immigration vulnerability limited their ability to demand change. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as early care and education expanded through private centers, public pre-kindergarten programs, and community-based organizations, Latino women became one of the fastest-growing segments of the workforce. Today, Latino women make up about 21.4% of the early care and education workforce nationwide, roughly 380,000 educators. They are disproportionately concentrated in roles closest to children's bodies: infant and toddler classrooms, assistant and aide positions, family childcare homes, and underfunded community-based programs. These roles require constant physical labor, emotional regulation, and relational work.
They are also among the lowest paid and least protected positions in the field. This concentration is not about skill or commitment. It is about how the system allocates risk. Latina women's position in early care and education is often governed through gratitude. Gratitude is frequently framed as cultural: warmth, humility, family orientation. But within institutions, gratitude functions as a form of governance. The message, often unspoken, is simple: be thankful to be here. For Indigenous Latina women, this message erases sovereignty and history. It treats belonging as conditional rather than inherent. For immigrant Latina women, the same message carries threat. Immigration enforcement regimes intensified in the late 20th and early 21st centuries shape what can be said safely at work, what advocacy is possible, and what risks feel survivable. Gratitude becomes a survival strategy. Silence becomes protection. Endurance becomes expectation. When Latina educators advocate for higher wages, better conditions, or language access, they are often framed as demanding rather than professional. Warmth can be reinterpreted as overfamiliarity. Boundaries can be reframed as attitude. This is not about individual behavior. It is about how belonging is made conditional. Latina women are frequently relied upon to stabilize early care and education systems under strain. They maintain relationship. Latina women are not overrepresented in early care and education by chance. They're there because the system was built to rely on them and to govern their labor through conditional belonging. This history does not stay in the past. It shows up now, in wages, in roles, in language access, in whose expertise is trusted and whose is dismissed. That is what we turn to next. Multicultural education, and all good teaching, is about transformation: individual, collective, and institutional. Each of these levels is needed to foster student learning. Sonia Nieto, The Light in Their Eyes. By now, the pattern should be clear. Latina women's relationship to early care and education did not emerge by accident, and it did not stabilize on its own. It developed through layered histories of indigenous continuity, colonization, labor migration, and immigration governance. Those histories did not end. They reorganized themselves inside the modern early care and education system. Today, Latina women make up roughly 1 in 5, about 21.4%, of the early care and education workforce nationwide. In states like California, Texas, Arizona, and across major metropolitan regions, that proportion is significantly higher. Latina women are especially likely to work in community-based programs, family childcare homes, and classrooms serving children from working-class and immigrant families. This concentration is not neutral. It reflects how the system allocates risk. Latina women are positioned closest to children's bodies and daily lives, in roles that require constant physical presence, emotional regulation, and relational labor. These roles are essential to quality. They are also among the least protected. And yet, quality does not persist in these settings by accident. It persists because Latina women have built systems, often outside formal recognition, that make care humane, culturally sustaining, and responsive when institutions fall short. This leadership becomes visible when we look at who organizes the field from the ground up. In California, Childcare Providers United emerged as a statewide movement led largely by Latina family childcare providers. These providers organized not as a professional association seeking prestige, but as a labor movement demanding structural change: fair reimbursement, health benefits, retirement security, and recognition of family childcare homes as essential public infrastructure. What makes this work significant is not just the scale, but the framing. Childcare Providers United centers family childcare, a sector dominated by Latina women, as foundational to the system, not peripheral. It challenges the idea that care provided in homes is informal or secondary, and it insists that quality cannot be sustained without economic dignity. This is governance work. Latina women have also built culturally grounded institutions that integrate early care, family support, and community health, recognizing that education does not exist in isolation. Organizations such as Instituto Familiar de la Raza have long supported Latina and Indigenous families through bilingual early childhood programming, mental health services, and family advocacy, In these spaces, early care is understood as part of a broader ecosystem of care that includes immigration stress, intergenerational trauma, and cultural continuity. Educators working within these models do more than teach children. They stabilize families. They translate systems. They create safety where institutions often generate fear. This work maintains quality not by complying with narrow definitions of professionalism, but by expanding what quality actually means. Latina women have also sustained care through neighborhood-based and culturally specific community centers, such as Centro de la Raza, where early childhood education is embedded within broader cultural, political, and social organizing. In these spaces, children are not separated from language, history, or community struggle. Education is relational, political, and protective. These institutions function as counter-systems. They absorb pressure that the formal early care and education system was never designed to hold. Immigration enforcement fear, language exclusion, economic precarity, and racialized surveillance. And they do so largely through the labor of Latina women, whose expertise is rarely recognized as leadership. Family childcare homes offer another critical example. Across the country, Latina women operate care environments that are multilingual, multigenerational, and deeply relational. These homes often serve children whose families work non-standard hours, navigate mixed immigration status, or distrust formal institutions due to past harm. In these settings, quality is sustained through continuity. Children stay with the same caregiver for years. Siblings are cared for together. Language development happens naturally. Family relationships are preserved rather than managed. Yet these environments are often treated as informal stopgaps rather than as models of what relational care can look like at scale.
Latina women also sustain quality through informal professional networks, circles of mentorship, shared curriculum development, and collective problem solving that exist outside formal credentialing systems. These networks are essential in a field where access to training, leadership pathways, and professional recognition remains uneven. This labor is intellectual, it is pedagogical, and it is cultural, but it is rarely compensated. Language is one of the clearest places where this dynamic shows up. Latina educators are often the primary providers of care in languages other than English, particularly Spanish and Indigenous languages from across Latin America. They support bilingual development, interpret for families, and mediate between monolingual institutions and multilingual communities. Yet language ability is rarely treated as professional expertise. In many programs, bilingualism is assumed rather than rewarded. Translation is expected rather than compensated. Cultural mediation is required rather than recognized. Latina women are asked to make systems function across language barriers without being granted authority within those systems. This invisibility is not neutral. It reinforces a structure in which quality depends on unpaid cultural labor rather than institutional investment. Immigration precarity deepens this pattern. Many Latina women in early care and education navigate uncertain legal status, mixed status families, or the long-term effects of immigration enforcement regimes intensified in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This shapes what feels safe to say at work, how conflict is navigated, and whether advocacy feels survivable. In this context, gratitude becomes a form of governance. Latina educators are framed as warm, flexible, and grateful. These traits are celebrated culturally, but institutionally, they function as expectations. Gratitude is rewarded. Silence is interpreted as professionalism. Endurance becomes the price of belonging. When Latina women advocate for higher wages, language access, or leadership roles, they risk being reframed as ungrateful or disruptive. Boundaries can be misread as attitude. Advocacy can be treated as instability. This is not about individual communication. It is about how belonging is made conditional. And yet, Latina women continue to lead. They lead by organizing labor. They lead by building culturally sustaining institutions. They lead by protecting children and families from institutional harm. They lead by making quality possible where policy fails. This leadership mirrors what we have already seen. Indigenous women built sovereign systems after removal. Black women sustained quality within extraction. Latina women sustained care under precarity and conditional belonging. These are not separate stories. They are layered strategies within the same system.
Understanding how Latina women maintain quality today allows us to see how the system adapts to new labor sources without changing its core logic, and how much it relies on women whose authority it refuses to fully recognize.
And that prepares us for the next group in this story. Asian and Pacific Islander women are also deeply present in early care and education, often rendered invisible through aggregation and stereotype. Their relationship to the field reflects another form of conditional inclusion, shaped by credentialing, racial myth, and proximity to authority without access to power. That is what comes next. We urgently need a paradigm shift in our concept of the purposes and practices of education. Replace it with education as an ongoing process that enlists the tremendous energies and creativity of school children in rebuilding our communities, now, in the present. Grace Lee Boggs. Asian American and Pacific Islander women's relationship to early care and education in the United States begins not with inclusion, but with exclusion. This matters because exclusion shaped not only when Asian and Pacific Islander women were allowed to enter the country, but how they were allowed to enter, what kinds of labor they were permitted to do, and whether family, care, and authority were recognized as legitimate. Asian American and Pacific Islander women did not arrive in the United States through a single migration story. Their presence reflects multiple histories unfolding across different regions under different forms of empire, war, and labor demand. But across those histories, a consistent pattern emerges. Asian and Pacific Islander women were either barred entirely, admitted only conditionally, or rendered invisible within systems that relied on their labor while denying their authority. For Asian women, large-scale migration to the United States began in the mid-19th century, primarily through Chinese labor migration tied to mining, railroad construction, and industrial expansion. This migration was overwhelmingly male by design. Anti-Asian laws and social norms actively restricted the entry of Asian women, based on the belief that Asian families should not be allowed to settle permanently. This exclusion was formalized in law. The Page Act of 1875 was the first federal immigration law to restrict entry based on race and gender. While framed as a moral protection law, it effectively barred most Chinese women from entering the United States by presuming them to be immoral or associated with sex work. This law set the stage for broader exclusion. In 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law to ban immigration based explicitly on race and nationality. The law halted Chinese labor immigration and made Chinese families legally impossible to sustain. Asian women were not simply discouraged from entering the country, they were actively excluded, ensuring that Asian communities could not reproduce themselves through family life. This exclusion was not random. By preventing Asian women from immigrating, the state ensured that Asian men could be used as temporary laborers without becoming permanent members of society. Care, family, and continuity were deliberately disrupted. Other Asian groups face similar patterns. Japanese, Korean, and South Asian migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was governed by exclusionary laws, anti-miscegenation statutes, and naturalization restrictions that prevented Asian immigrants from becoming citizens or owning land. Asian women's entry was tightly controlled, often permitted only through narrow family reunification channels or as dependents, not as autonomous workers. Caregiving labor became one of the few spaces where Asian women could work under these constraints. Domestic service, household labor, and informal caregiving roles allowed Asian women to earn income while remaining socially invisible. These roles required emotional labor, patience, and constant proximity to white families, yet offered little protection, recognition, or authority. For Pacific Islander women, the story begins differently, but leads to similar outcomes. United States expansion into the Pacific, including the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 and the subsequent annexation of Hawaii, as well as the colonization of Guam, American Samoa, and other island nations, did not involve immigration in the traditional sense. Pacific Islander women were not immigrants entering the United States. They were indigenous women whose lands were absorbed into United States empire. This distinction matters deeply for early care and education. Pacific Islander women held central roles in indigenous systems of care, education, and child rearing long before colonization.
As in other Indigenous contexts, these systems were relational, collective, and governed by community authority. Colonization disrupted these systems, imposed Western schooling models, and relocated authority away from local knowledge holders. Pacific Islander women were not invited into educational leadership, they were displaced from it. As the 20th century progressed, Asian American women entered the United States in new waves, shaped by global conflict and United States military intervention. After the Second World War, changes in immigration policy allowed limited family reunification. Many Asian women arrived as war brides, refugees, or dependents, rather than as workers with recognized skills. Later, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 reshaped migration patterns by eliminating national origin quotas. This opened the door to increased migration from Asia and the Pacific, including women arriving as professionals, caregivers, refugees, and family members. But this inclusion was still conditional. Credentials were often not recognized. Language barriers were treated as personal deficits. Cultural difference was framed as something to manage rather than honor. Early care and education became one of the sectors where Asian American and Pacific Islander women could find work across these varied migration pathways. The field's low wages, high turnover, and limited credential barriers made entry possible, but protection remained minimal. At the same time, Asian American and Pacific Islander women were governed through a racial narrative that shaped how their labor was interpreted. The model minority myth framed Asian Americans as disciplined, compliant, and successful through quiet effort. In early care and education, this narrative translated into expectations of professionalism, deference, and adaptability. Asian American and Pacific Islander women were often perceived as reliable and competent, but not as leaders or change agents. This created a specific form of invisibility. Because harm does not always show up as exclusion, sometimes it shows up as silence. Asian American and Pacific Islander women are often underrepresented in conversations about racial inequity in early care and education, precisely because they are assumed not to need support. Aggregated data collapses vast differences between East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, and Pacific Islander communities, masking disparities in wages, working conditions, and access to leadership. Pacific Islander women, in particular, are frequently erased altogether when data categories merge them into broader Asian American groupings. This invisibility is structural. It allows the system to claim diversity without accountability. It allows proximity to institutional norms to stand in for power. And it reinforces the idea that Asian American and Pacific Islander women are present, but not political. Yet proximity is not the same as authority. Asian American and Pacific Islander women remain underrepresented in leadership roles, policy-shaping spaces, and decision-making positions that define quality, funding, and standards. When they advocate, they often face pressure to remain neutral, to avoid naming racism, and to frame concerns as individual misunderstandings rather than systemic harm. Advocacy can be framed as disruption. Boundary setting can be read as inflexibility. Silence can be mistaken for agreement. This is governance through invisibility. And it fits within the broader pattern we have been tracing. Indigenous women were removed, forcing them to build outside the system. Black women were extracted, forcing them to sustain the system from within. Latina women are governed through precarity and gratitude. Asian American and Pacific Islander women are governed through exclusion, aggregation, and proximity without power. These are not separate stories. They are layered strategies within the same structure. This history does not stay in the past. It shows up now, in who is counted, who is heard, and whose leadership is considered legitimate. And it sets the stage for the present. Because Asian American and Pacific Islander women are not only positioned by the system, they are actively reshaping it. To see that clearly, we have to look at the organizations, agencies, and collective efforts through which Asian American and Pacific Islander women sustain quality, challenge invisibility, and build power in early care and education today. Cultural people have to become political. Our culture can't just be ornamental or recreational. Honani K. Trask, Kanaka Maoli, Hawaiian educator and sovereignty leader. By this point in the episode, a familiar structure has emerged. Asian American and Pacific Islander women did not enter early care and education through open inclusion. They entered through exclusion, conditional entry, and aggregation. That history did not end. It reorganized itself inside the modern early care and education system, shaping how Asian American and Pacific Islander women are seen, how their labor is interpreted, and how their leadership is constrained. But as with every group we have discussed so far, this is not only a story about how the system positions people. It is also a story about what people do anyway. Asian American and Pacific Islander women are not simply present in early care and education. They are actively sustaining quality, pedagogy, and institutional memory, often in ways that remain unnamed because they do not fit dominant narratives of leadership. This becomes clear when we look at where Asian American and Pacific Islander women organize. Across the United States, Asian American and Pacific Islander women have built community-based early childhood programs that integrate language, culture, family support, and education in ways the formal system rarely does. These programs often emerge in response to gaps created by aggregation and invisibility, gaps where families do not see themselves reflected in curriculum, language access, or institutional decision-making. Organizations such as Asian American and Pacific Islander Community Development in Oakland have long supported early childhood education as part of broader community stabilization efforts. In these spaces, early care is not separated from housing security, immigration stress, language access, or intergenerational well-being. Education is treated as relational infrastructure, not just service delivery. This integrated approach matters because Asian American and Pacific Islander families often navigate multiple layers of marginalization at once: language barriers, refugee trauma, underemployment, and racial stereotyping that frames need as invisible. Programs led and staffed by Asian American and Pacific Islander women are often the only places where those realities are addressed holistically. Language is one of the clearest places where this system-shaping work shows up. Asian American and Pacific Islander women are frequently the primary educators providing care in languages other than English, including Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Khmer, Samoan, Tongan, and many others. In classrooms and family childcare homes, they support bilingual development, interpret for families, and mediate between monolingual institutions and multilingual communities. Yet language labor is rarely treated as professional expertise. Translation is expected rather than compensated. Cultural mediation is required rather than recognized. Asian American and Pacific Islander women are asked to make systems function across linguistic boundaries without being granted authority within those systems. This invisibility is structural. It allows quality to be maintained through unpaid cultural labor, while institutions claim neutrality. Asian American and Pacific Islander women have also sustained quality through family child care homes and small community-based programs that operate outside large institutional frameworks. These spaces are often multi-generational, multilingual, and deeply relational. Children remain with the same caregiver over long periods of time. Families develop trust that extends beyond enrollment cycles and funding streams. In these environments, quality is sustained through continuity, cultural fluency, and relationship, not through compliance alone. Yet these models are frequently undervalued in policy conversations, precisely because they do not conform to dominant definitions of professionalism shaped by whiteness and credentialing. Asian American and Pacific Islander women have also built advocacy and leadership infrastructure to address the harms created by aggregation. Groups such as National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum have played an important role in making visible how race, gender, immigration status, and labor intersect for Asian American and Pacific Islander women. While not limited to early care and education, this policy work has shaped how caregiving labor, family policy, and workforce equity are understood, challenging the idea that Asian American and Pacific Islander women do not experience systemic harm. This kind of advocacy matters because invisibility is not simply about numbers. It is about whose experiences are treated as structural.
Before we name invisibility, we have to name capacity. Asian American and Pacific Islander women have sustained early care and education through multilingual pedagogy, intergenerational care networks, mutual aid, and institution building, often while the system treats their stability as proof that no support is needed. In early care and education, Asian American and Pacific Islander women are often assumed to be doing fine. Their presence is used to signal diversity. Their silence is misread as satisfaction. Their proximity to institutional norms is mistaken for access to power. But proximity is not power. Asian American and Pacific Islander women remain underrepresented in leadership roles that shape funding, standards, and policy. When they do enter leadership, they often face pressure to remain apolitical, to avoid naming racism, and to frame concerns as technical issues rather than structural inequities. Advocacy can be framed as disruption. Boundary setting can be read as inflexibility. Silence can be mistaken for agreement. This is governance through silence. And yet, Asian American and Pacific Islander women continue to lead, often through collective rather than individual pathways. They lead by creating culturally sustaining curricula where children see themselves reflected. They lead by protecting families from institutional harm through translation and mediation. They lead by mentoring one another in spaces where formal leadership pathways are closed. They lead by insisting that quality cannot be separated from dignity, language, and belonging. This leadership is not always visible because it does not conform to dominant leadership models that prioritize individual authority over collective care. But it is leadership nonetheless, and it reveals another parallel with the groups we have already discussed. Indigenous women built sovereign systems after removal. Black women sustained quality under extraction. Latina women maintained care under precarity and conditional belonging. Asian American and Pacific Islander women sustain quality under invisibility, aggregation, and proximity without power. These are not isolated dynamics. They are coordinated outcomes of the same system design. Understanding how Asian American and Pacific Islander women sustain quality today allows us to see how the system adapts to difference without relinquishing control. It incorporates language, culture, and labor, while limiting authority, visibility, and power. It allows proximity to institutions without full belonging. And it governs through silence as much as through exclusion. But race is not the only axis shaping this condition. Immigration status cuts across everything we have discussed so far. Asian American and Pacific Islander women include refugees, migrants, and people whose movement was shaped by war, displacement, and United States military intervention. Their participation in early care and education is often shaped not only by race, but by documentation, language access, and the constant calculation of risk. And this is not unique to them. Across early care and education, immigrant women of many racial backgrounds, Indigenous, Black, Latina, Asian American and Pacific Islander, and white, navigate a distinct form of governance, one structured by legal vulnerability, conditional belonging, and the threat of removal. Immigration status reshapes what advocacy feels possible. It reshapes what silence protects. It reshapes how care labor is extracted and controlled. To fully understand how the system maintains itself, we have to look directly at immigration, not as identity, but as governance. That is where we turn next, to immigrant women and how early care and education relies on legal precarity to stabilize itself. Only after we understand that can we clearly name the role of whiteness, including white women's protection, proximity to power, and alignment within this system, without confusion or collapse. One child, one teacher, one pen, and one book can change the world. Malala Yousafzai. Part 1. Legal precarity, policy design, and care as governance. To understand early care and education in the United States, we have to understand immigration not as identity, but as governance. Immigration policy has never been neutral. It has been a tool for determining who can enter, who can stay, who can work, and under what conditions. And in early care and education, immigration status has functioned as a quiet but powerful mechanism for structuring vulnerability, silence, and compliance. A quick research-based anchor point before we go deeper.
Immigrants make up about 1 in 5 childcare workers, about 20.1%, which is roughly 282,900 people. And in childcare, this is overwhelmingly women's work. Immigrant women have always been present in care work in the United States, but their presence has never been accidental, and it has never been fully protected. Instead, it has been shaped by law, by immigration regimes that regulate not only movement across borders, but access to rights, labor protections, and voice. From the late 19th century onward, care work became one of the primary sites where immigrant women were permitted, tolerated, or absorbed into the labor force, precisely because it was feminized, undervalued, and weakly regulated. Between the 1880s and the early 1920s, millions of immigrant women arrived in the United States from Europe, particularly from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, and parts of Scandinavia. Many settled in rapidly industrializing cities such as New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Domestic service and childcare were among the most common forms of employment available to them, especially for women without English fluency or recognized credentials. Care work functioned as an entry point into the economy, not because it offered stability or protection, but because it demanded obedience, invisibility, and emotional labor rather than formal skill recognition. At the same time, immigration policy explicitly restricted the entry of many non-European women. Asian women, including Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and South Asian women, were barred or severely restricted through laws such as the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. These laws were designed to prevent family formation and permanence, ensuring that Asian labor remained temporary and extractable. Asian women who did enter the country were often confined to domestic service or caregiving roles, operating under surveillance and threat. South Asian women, particularly from what are now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, faced near total exclusion until the mid-20th century. When they did arrive, it was often through narrow professional or family-based channels that limited economic autonomy and political voice. For Black immigrant women, particularly from the Caribbean and later from African nations, immigration intersected with racialization in distinct ways. Caribbean women began arriving in larger numbers in the early 20th century, often settling in cities such as New York and Miami. African women's migration increased later, particularly after the 1960s. Despite different origins, Black immigrant women were often folded into existing racial hierarchies that treated Black women's care labor as natural, expendable, and unworthy of protection. Care work became one of the few sectors where Black immigrant women could find employment across language and credential barriers, but it also placed them under the same surveillance and devaluation faced by Black women born in the United States, compounded by legal vulnerability. For Indigenous women whose communities were divided by imposed borders, including Indigenous women from Mexico, Central America, and parts of the Caribbean, immigration status often reflected colonial boundary making rather than migration. These women navigated early care and education under layers of displacement, Indigenous erasure, racialization, and immigration law applied to lands and peoples that predated the nation-state. Pacific Islander women, particularly from Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, and other island nations under United States control, were not immigrants in the conventional sense. They were Indigenous women whose lands were absorbed into empire. Yet their movement, labor, and access to education were governed through similar logics of conditional belonging and external authority. By the 1920s, immigration restriction intensified. The Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas that sharply limited immigration from Asia, Africa, and Southern and Eastern Europe. Family reunification became nearly impossible for many groups. Women's entry was tightly controlled, often dependent on male sponsorship or narrow domestic labor categories. Caregiving labor remained one of the few spaces where immigrant women could work under these constraints. The mid-20th century reshaped immigration again. Following the Second World War, new pathways opened through refugee resettlement, family reunification, and war-related migration. Women arrived as war brides, displaced persons, and dependents of United States service members. Many entered without independent legal standing or recognized professional credentials. At the same time, domestic and agricultural workers remained excluded from core labor protections, including minimum wage and overtime pay. This exclusion meant that immigrant women performing care work continued to operate outside the legal boundaries of protected employment. Care remained structurally vulnerable labor. The passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 marked a major turning point. By eliminating national origin quotas, the law increased immigration from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Women arrived in larger numbers, including Latina women, Asian women, South Asian women, Caribbean women, African women, and Middle Eastern women, often through family-based migration, refugee resettlement, or undocumented pathways shaped by economic displacement and United States foreign policy. By the 1970s and 1980s, immigrant women had become a growing share of the early care and education workforce, particularly in states such as California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, and New Jersey. Early care and education became one of the few sectors where immigrant women could find work, regardless of documentation status. This was not because the field was inclusive. It was because the field was underregulated. Low wages, informal arrangements, family childcare homes, and weak enforcement of labor standards allowed early care and education to absorb legal vulnerability without structural change. Immigration precarity did not disrupt the system. It stabilized it. This dynamic intensified in the late 20th century. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 legalized some undocumented workers while criminalizing the hiring of others, increasing fear and uncertainty in the labor market. Immigration enforcement expanded further in the 1990s and again after September 11, 2001, reshaping what advocacy felt possible for immigrant women working in care settings. By the early 2000s, immigrant women constituted a substantial share of the early care and education workforce in major metropolitan areas. In some regions, immigrant women accounted for more than 1/3 of family childcare providers and center-based staff. Yet data on immigration status in early care and education remains incomplete by design. National workforce datasets rarely track immigration status. When they do, the data is fragmented or aggregated in ways that obscure risk and difference. This invisibility allows the system to rely on immigrant labor without fully accounting for the conditions under which that labor is performed. Immigration status shapes daily decision-making in early care and education. It shapes what can be said in staff meetings. It shapes whether grievances are filed. It shapes whether unsafe conditions are challenged. Legal vulnerability becomes a mechanism of governance. Silence becomes protection. Endurance becomes expectation. Gratitude becomes currency. This governance cuts across race, but it does not operate evenly. Indigenous immigrant women navigate borders imposed on their lands and identities. Black immigrant women encounter racialization that compounds legal vulnerability. Latina immigrant women are governed through both racial profiling and immigration enforcement regimes that explicitly target their communities. Asian American and Pacific Islander immigrant women navigate aggregation, invisibility, and refugee trauma alongside language exclusion. South Asian women often face credential devaluation and gendered labor channeling. Caribbean and African women navigate racialization layered with accent discrimination and legal insecurity. Middle Eastern and North African women face surveillance shaped by geopolitics and Islamophobia. White immigrant women may also experience documentation vulnerability, but whiteness often reshapes how that vulnerability is perceived and mitigated. This distinction matters because immigration explains vulnerability. Whiteness explains protection. In California, immigrant women played a central role in building Child Care Providers United, a statewide union formally recognized in 2020 after years of organizing Deliberate. The union represents tens of thousands of family child care providers, the majority of whom are immigrant women. Their work reframed family child care not as informal labor, but as public infrastructure essential to the state's economy. This was not symbolic recognition. It resulted in higher reimbursement rates, access to health benefits, and the first steps toward retirement security for a workforce long excluded from protection. Immigrant women transformed legal vulnerability into collective leverage, demonstrating that quality care cannot be sustained without economic dignity. This kind of system shaping extends beyond labor organizing. Immigrant women have also sustained early care and education through community-based organizations that integrate childcare, family support, legal navigation, and health services, recognizing that education cannot be separated from immigration fear and economic instability. In San Francisco, Instituto Familiar de la Raza, founded in 1978, has supported predominantly immigrant and indigenous Latina families through bilingual early childhood programs, mental health services, and family advocacy. Educators in these programs, many of them immigrant women, do far more than teach children. They stabilize families living under immigration enforcement pressure, intergenerational trauma, and systemic exclusion. In Seattle, El Centro de la Raza, founded in 1972, embeds early childhood education within broader cultural, political, and economic organizing. Children are not separated from language, history, or community struggle. Care is understood as collective responsibility rather than service delivery. These institutions absorb pressures the formal early care and education system was never designed to hold. They manage language access where public systems fail. They create safety where enrollment systems generate fear. They maintain continuity where funding cycles destabilize programs. And they do so largely through the labor of immigrant women, whose authority is rarely recognized as leadership. In early care and education, immigrant women are often relied upon to fill gaps created by underfunding, turnover, and instability. They are expected to be flexible, accommodating, and grateful. Their presence is framed as opportunity rather than exploitation. When immigrant women advocate for higher wages, safer conditions, or language access, legal precarity can be weaponized, sometimes explicitly, often implicitly. This is not an interpersonal failure. It is structural design. And yet, immigrant women are not passive within this structure. They build care networks. They sustain quality under constraint. They protect children and families when institutions fail. Understanding immigrant women's relationship to early care and education requires holding two truths at once. Immigrant women are governed through legal precarity, and immigrant women are essential to the system's survival. That contradiction is not coincidental. It is foundational. Because immigrant women do not only endure this system, they also shape it through organizations, advocacy, and collective practices that make quality possible even under conditions of risk. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If Part 1 showed how immigration policy governs care labor, then this section shows what immigrant women have done anyway. Because despite legal precarity, surveillance, language barriers, and the constant calculation of risk, immigrant women have built and sustained much of what makes early care and education function at all. Not in theory, in practice. In classrooms, in homes, in community spaces, and in the policy scaffolding that holds the system together when it would otherwise collapse. This is not abstract. Across the United States today, immigrant women make up a substantial portion of the early care and education workforce, particularly in states such as California, Texas, New York, Florida, New Jersey, Illinois, Washington, and Massachusetts. In many metropolitan regions, immigrant women constitute 1/3 or more of family child care providers and center-based educators. This includes Latina women, Asian American and Pacific Islander women, Black immigrant women from the Caribbean and Africa, South Asian women, Middle Eastern and North African women, Indigenous immigrant women, and white immigrant women. These women are concentrated in the parts of the system that require the most trust and continuity: infant and toddler care, family child care homes, neighborhood-based programs, and under-resourced centers serving working-class communities. Quality persists in these spaces not because the system protects immigrant women, but because immigrant women intervene constantly to prevent harm. One of the clearest places this intervention is visible is in family child care. Across California, New York, Illinois, and Massachusetts, immigrant women have operated family child care homes for decades, often in languages other than English, often serving families working non-standard hours, and often doing so without stable reimbursement or benefits. These homes provide continuity of care, cultural fluency, multilingual development, and deep relationships with families navigating economic and legal precarity. Family child care has long been treated as informal or secondary within early care and education policy. But immigrant women have insisted, through practice and organizing, that these homes are not peripheral. They are core infrastructure. Women from Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and other Caribbean and African nations have long worked in early care and education, particularly in cities such as New York, Miami, Boston, Atlanta, Houston, and Minneapolis. Their labor is shaped by both immigration precarity and racialization within a system already built on Black women's extraction. Organizations such as Black Alliance for Just Immigration and African Communities Together have documented how immigration enforcement compounds racialized labor extraction in sectors like childcare. While not early childhood organizations alone, their research and organizing explain why Black immigrant women are overrepresented in care work and underprotected within it. Black immigrant women bring pedagogical traditions shaped by transnational caregiving, extended family structures, and community accountability. Yet their expertise is frequently collapsed into stereotypes about Black labor, rather than recognized as professional leadership. South Asian women also occupy a specific position. Women from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan have entered early care and education through family child care homes, religious institutions, and community-based programs, particularly in New Jersey, New York, California, and Texas. Many navigate credential devaluation despite high levels of education. Care work becomes one of the few sectors where language barriers and non-recognized degrees can be absorbed. Organizations such as South Asian Americans Leading Together and Manavi have documented how gendered labor channeling pushes South Asian women into caregiving roles while rendering their professional expertise invisible. These dynamics show up clearly in early care and education, where South Asian women are expected to be compliant, family-oriented, and grateful, rather than authoritative. Middle Eastern and North African women face another layer. Women from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan often enter early care and education under surveillance shaped by geopolitics, Islamophobia, and post-September 11 enforcement regimes. Care work offers entry into the labor market, but advocacy is constrained by fear of scrutiny or retaliation. Organizations such as Arab American Family Support Center have supported immigrant women navigating childcare, language access, and family stability under these conditions. Educators working in these contexts provide care not only for children, but for families navigating systems that treat them as suspect. Asian American and Pacific Islander immigrant women sustain quality in another way. Across California, Washington, Hawaii, and New York, immigrant women from China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, Samoa, Tonga, and other Pacific Island nations operate early childhood programs connected to cultural centers, faith communities, and mutual aid networks. These programs maintain language, intergenerational relationships, and community accountability in systems that often erase them through aggregation. Organizations such as Asian American and Pacific Islander Community Development and Pacific Islander Community Association support early childhood initiatives that integrate housing, language, and family support, recognizing that quality care requires stable community conditions.
Across all of these groups, language labor is central. Immigrant women are routinely the primary educators, providing care in languages other than English. They translate for families, interpret regulations, mediate between institutions and communities, and support bilingual and multilingual development for children. Work consistently shown to benefit cognitive and social outcomes. Yet language labor is rarely compensated. Translation is expected rather than paid. Cultural mediation is required rather than recognized. Multilingualism is treated as convenience rather than professional expertise. Quality depends on this labor, while institutions deny its value. Immigrant women also sustain quality through informal professional networks, circles of mentorship, shared curriculum development, and collective problem solving that exist outside credentialing pipelines. These networks function as shadow infrastructure in a field that offers limited formal support. There is also a critical layer of data and visibility work. Early care and education was built to rely on immigrant labor without fully accounting for it. Immigration status is rarely tracked in national workforce datasets. When data is collected, it is often aggregated in ways that erase difference and risk. Against this backdrop, the Berkeley Center for the Study of Childcare Employment has been instrumental in documenting wages, working conditions, racial composition, and policy impacts across the workforce. While immigration status itself is often absent from official data, this research makes visible the structural conditions under which immigrant women labor: low wages, high turnover, lack of benefits, and chronic instability. In a system designed not to see immigrant women clearly, producing rigorous data becomes an intervention. It reframes exploitation as structural.
It challenges policy built on partial truths. It makes reliance on immigrant labor harder to deny. Here, data itself becomes part of care infrastructure. Understanding immigrant women's system-shaping role requires holding two truths at once. Immigrant women are governed through legal precarity, and immigrant women are among the primary maintainers of quality in early care and education. They sustain classrooms, they stabilize families, they translate systems, they protect children from institutional harm. They do this across race, language, religion, and immigration status, often without protection, recognition, or authority. And this brings us to a necessary clarification. Immigrant women include white women, but whiteness reshapes how immigration is experienced. White immigrant women may still navigate documentation issues or credential recognition, but racial buffering often softens the consequences in how professionalism is interpreted, how credibility is assigned, and how risk is distributed. Immigration explains vulnerability. Whiteness explains protection. That distinction matters, because only after we understand how immigrant women are governed through legal precarity can we clearly name the role of white women, including white immigrant women, in stabilizing this system through proximity, management, and alignment. If we are going to talk honestly about demographics in early care and education, we have to start much earlier than most histories allow. We have to start at the beginning of European settlement in what are now called the Americas. White women did not arrive here as neutral caregivers. They arrived as part of a colonial project. And from the earliest moments of that project, white women occupied a specific role within systems of racial domination. They were positioned as the managers of domestic life and the overseers of care labor performed by others. This matters because the demographic position white women hold in early care and education today did not emerge accidentally in the 20th century. It evolved directly from this earlier role. From the 17th century forward, European women, particularly English, French, Spanish, and Dutch women, were embedded in colonial households that depended on the labor of indigenous women and increasingly enslaved African women. While white men structured the legal and economic systems of colonization and slavery, white women were tasked with enforcing those systems within the intimate spaces of home and child rearing. They did not merely benefit from enslaved labor, they supervised it. White women were responsible for directing indigenous women and enslaved black women in the care of children, including the care of white children. They set expectations, they enforced routines, they punished deviation, they monitored behavior. They controlled access to resources, food, rest, and proximity to children. This was not informal assistance, it was management. White women did not own the legal apparatus of slavery, but they operated as its daily administrators in domestic space. They upheld racial hierarchies through caregiving practices, deciding whose labor was trusted, whose bodies were disciplined, and whose knowledge was dismissed or extracted. At the same time, indigenous women and black women did not lose their knowledge, skill, or sovereignty simply because they were forced into these roles. They carried deep traditions of care, pedagogy, healing, and collective child rearing, traditions that predated European arrival and that persisted despite violent suppression. Their agency did not disappear, but it was constrained by force. White women's authority over caregiving labor was backed by law, violence, and the constant threat of punishment. It was not symbolic. It was structural. This arrangement established a hierarchy that would repeat itself over centuries. White men designing the system, white women managing its daily operations, and indigenous women and black women bearing the greatest risk and extraction within it. As slavery ended and the United States industrialized, white women's relationship to care work shifted, but the racial architecture did not disappear. Two changes matter here. First, white women were increasingly positioned as the proper face of child development expertise. This is the era when early childhood education begins to professionalize, through the kindergarten movement and later through child development science. Second, the tasks of daily care were not fully transferred to white women as a class. Instead, they were reorganized. White women moved into supervisory and credentialed roles, while women of color and immigrants continued to do the lowest paid, least protected work. The kindergarten movement is a concrete example. The first U.S. kindergarten opened in 1856, and the first public kindergarten opened in 1873. Those milestones are often told as a story of educational progress. But they are also a story of whose knowledge became professional, whose labor became waged, and whose labor remained help. And when the state has wanted to treat childcare as public infrastructure, such as during World War II when federal funding supported childcare so women could work, it has proven it can. The rollback of those investments shows that the scarcity we live with now is political, not inevitable. As slavery expanded and hardened into law, this division became more formalized. White women were charged with maintaining moral order within the household. That moral authority extended over enslaved women tasked with childcare, wet nursing, and domestic labor. White women set the rules. Enslaved women absorbed the consequences. This history reveals something foundational. Caregiving in the United States was racialized from the start, and white women were positioned not simply as caregivers, but as supervisors of other women's care. When slavery was legally abolished, that structure did not disappear. It transformed. Black women were pushed into low-wage domestic and caregiving labor under new forms of coercion. Indigenous women continued to face forced removal, assimilation policies, and the dismantling of communal caregiving systems. Later, Latina women, Asian women, Pacific Islander women, and immigrant women would be funneled into similar roles through immigration policy, labor law, and economic necessity. White women, meanwhile, remained positioned as the legitimate managers of care. As the United States moved toward formal schooling and institutional childcare in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the supervisory role white women had long held in private households migrated into public institutions. The language changed. The hierarchy did not. White women became teachers, matrons, supervisors, and directors. The authority they had exercised informally over enslaved and marginalized women's labor was recast as professionalism, moral leadership, and educational expertise. This transition is often narrated as progress for women, and in some ways it was. White women gained access to paid roles, public authority, and institutional legitimacy. But that access was built on a foundation that had already normalized white women's authority over caregiving labor performed by others. By the time early care and education emerged as a formal field, the racial architecture was already in place. White women were widely accepted as the appropriate faces of care. Indigenous women, Black women, Latina women, Asian women, Pacific Islander women, and immigrant women were widely expected to do the most precarious, least protected, and lowest paid work, often under the supervision of white women. This is the demographic reality we inherit. Today, white women make up about 55.6%, approximately 987,900 early educators, in a 2022 ACS-based estimate of the early care and education workforce nationwide. They are overrepresented not only in classrooms, but in leadership roles: directors, coordinators, trainers, licensors, and policy-facing advocates. But scale alone does not explain power. White women's dominance in early care and education reflects a long-standing social assignment: to manage care, to enforce norms, and to stabilize systems built by others. Their labor continues to be underpaid. Their emotional labor continues to be exploited. But their exploitation is buffered by race in ways that are not available to Indigenous women, Black women, Latina women, Asian women, Pacific Islander women, and immigrant women doing the same work. White women are more likely to be trusted by families, more likely to be perceived as professional, more likely to be promoted into leadership, more likely to be believed when harm is named, more likely to be protected when conflict arises. These patterns are not the result of individual virtue. They are the inheritance of a system that has long positioned white women as the acceptable managers of care. So the question is not whether white women matter in early care and education. The question is how their position, forged in colonization and slavery, refined through professionalization, and maintained through institutional legitimacy, has helped reproduce a system that resists change. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, codebooks, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Peggy McIntosh, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. By now, the structure should be visible. White women did not arrive in early care and education by accident. They were positioned there, first as managers of enslaved and coerced caregiving labor, later as institutional stewards of care systems built by white men. That placement did not end with slavery or professionalization. It evolved. And that evolution is why the system looks the way it does today. What we are living with now is not a broken system. It is a functioning one. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do: stabilize itself by distributing risk unevenly, buffering some while exhausting others, and converting care into compliance. This is where white women's role becomes decisive. In the present-day early care and education system, white women occupy the position of interface. They are the ones families see. They are the ones staff answer to. They are the ones who translate policy into practice, and practice back into policy language. That interface role is not symbolic. It is operational. And it explains why reform so often stalls. When women marginalized by racialization and colonial power name harm in early care and education, they are often naming structural violence, unsafe ratios, racialized discipline, immigration-related precarity, wage theft, surveillance, retaliation, and silencing. But those harms rarely move upward on their own. They move, or don't, based on whether white women decide to carry them forward. This is one of the hardest truths to say out loud. The system does not change primarily because white women are not usually required to risk their protection in order to survive it. The system offers white women a familiar bargain. It is rarely spoken explicitly, but it is widely understood. You may be underpaid, overworked, and emotionally depleted, but if you remain aligned, if you manage conflict rather than escalate it, if you frame harm as misunderstanding rather than injustice, you will remain safe enough. Safe enough to lead. Safe enough to advance. Safe enough to be believed. That safety is conditional, and it is powerful. It is why systems that claim to value equity can continue to reproduce racial hierarchy, not because white women do not see harm, but because the system rewards containment over disruption.
This is how the architecture of slavery reproduces itself without chains. White men still sit at the top, as funders, policymakers, board members, and architects of law and finance, largely absent from the daily labor of care. And the system keeps moving. It keeps moving because white women are positioned as its stabilizers. But that positioning also creates a choice point. Because when white women refuse alignment, the system feels it. When white women vote differently, speak differently, document differently, protect differently, and intervene differently, the system becomes unstable. This is not about charity. It is about responsibility. White women are not being asked to save anyone. Those most harmed have never needed saving. White women are being asked to stop serving as the buffer that absorbs institutional pressure while deflecting it away from those most harmed. That requires action, not sentiment. It requires refusing to discipline Indigenous and Black children more harshly while calling it classroom management. It requires refusing to write up Latina women and immigrant women for tone while excusing the same behavior in others. It requires refusing to implement policies that punish Asian women and Pacific Islander women for cultural difference while calling it professionalism. It requires documenting retaliation instead of managing it away. It requires escalating harm instead of translating it into something palatable. And yes, it requires using whiteness strategically, because whiteness already functions as currency in early care and education. The question is not whether it exists, the question is how it is spent. White women already know how to navigate institutions. They already know how to speak the language of policy, quality, compliance, and care. The choice is whether those skills are used to stabilize the system or to disrupt it. Disruption has consequences.
Like they want us to be distracted. They don't want us to come together. And just as women in general, like they don't want white women to get along with Black women or Native Americans get along with the Spanish. Like they don't want us as a whole to get along. They want us to be in competition with each other and make it about race all the time.
And those consequences are precisely what Indigenous women, Black women, Latina women, Asian women, Pacific Islander women, and immigrant women have been absorbing for generations. Solidarity is not symbolic alignment. It is shared risk. And this is where we have to be honest about why the system resists change. The system resists change because too many people who are buffered by it are unwilling to make themselves vulnerable to protect others. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. But structures only persist when they are maintained. White women did not create this system alone, and they cannot dismantle it alone. But they are essential to its transformation. Which brings us to the next layer. Because above this hinge, above white women's alignment and disalignment, sits a group that has largely escaped accountability in early care and education. Men. And more specifically, white men. Which leads us to the next section. One of the clearest through lines is how management migrates from the private household into the public system. In the slavery era, management was direct. Who gets fed? Who is punished? Who is trusted with a child? In the modern era, management often looks like paperwork, credentials, and standards. This is where white women's role becomes especially pivotal. White women are often positioned as the implementers of policy, listeners, coaches, administrators, observers, curriculum leads. Those roles can be used to protect children and support educators, but they can also be used to police, to report, and to reproduce white norms as neutral. So the hinge is not abstract. It is practical. It is in the daily choice between using authority to maintain the hierarchy or using authority to redistribute safety and dignity. I argue it started in 1619. K-12 is seen as part of the public good, whereas childcare is seen as part of the service industry. Maurice, Sykes. Now we need to talk about men in early care and education. And we need to do it carefully. One data point makes that clear immediately. Women are roughly 97% of the ECE workforce. So when we talk about men here, we're talking about a small minority in the daily labor and a disproportionate presence in the architecture of power. Because men do not occupy a single position in this system. They are distributed across it unevenly, by race, by history, and by proximity to power. Any conversation that collapses all men into one category misses how the system actually works. So we begin where we began elsewhere, with history. Before colonization, Indigenous men were not absent from education or caregiving. They were teachers, storytellers, knowledge keepers, healers, hunters, builders, and cultural transmitters. Education was not separated from life. Children learned through participation, observation, responsibility, and relationship. Men and women held distinct roles, but those roles were not organized through domination. Colonization shattered this. European settlers did not merely dispossess Indigenous people of land. They targeted Indigenous social structures, including men's roles as educators, protectors, and cultural anchors. Boarding schools, forced removal, and the criminalization of Indigenous lifeways deliberately severed men from children, from language, and from authority. Indigenous men were not excluded from education because they lacked capacity. They were excluded because their presence threatened colonial control. The removal of Indigenous men from caregiving and teaching was a strategy. It weakened families. It fractured knowledge transmission. It made children more governable. And yet, Indigenous men did not disappear. They resisted through ceremony, through storytelling, through clandestine teaching, through survival itself. Their absence from formal early care and education systems today is not evidence of disinterest. It is evidence of a system built to erase them. Black men's relationship to caregiving and education in the United States has been shaped by a different but equally violent history. Under slavery, black men were systematically separated from their families. Enslavers used forced separation as a tool of control, selling children away from parents, denying men the ability to protect, nurture, or raise their own families. This was not a fluke. It was structural. Black fatherhood and black male caregiving were treated as threats.
After emancipation, those same logics persisted. Jim Crow laws, racial terror, mass incarceration, labor exploitation, and economic exclusion continued to disrupt Black men's ability to remain present in family life and education. The system criminalized Black masculinity while simultaneously blaming Black men for the consequences of that criminalization. Black men were not absent from care because they did not care. They were pushed out, violently and deliberately. And when Black men did show up in educational spaces, their presence was often treated with suspicion, as disciplinarians rather than nurturers, as threats rather than teachers, as problems to be managed rather than leaders to be trusted. Even today, Black men who enter early care and education face heightened surveillance, racialized suspicion, and barriers that white men and white women do not. Their marginalization is not neutral. It is the continuation of a long strategy designed to sever Black men from caregiving authority. Because while Indigenous men and Black men were being removed, erased, or criminalized within caregiving and educational systems, another group of men was consolidating power over those systems: white men. White men are often described as absent from early care and education. And on a surface level, that appears true. They are rarely in classrooms, rarely changing diapers, rarely present in the daily labor of care. But absence from labor is not absence from power. White men have been and remain the primary architects and maintainers of early care and education systems. They design the laws. They control the funding. They sit on boards. They shape policy. They define what is feasible, what is fundable, and what is expendable. Their distance from caregiving is not a weakness. It is an advantage, because it allows white men to extract value from care work while avoiding accountability for its conditions. It allows them to benefit from a feminized, racialized workforce without being implicated in its exhaustion. And crucially, white men do not maintain this system alone. They rely on proximity. They rely on people positioned closer to daily operations, often white women, to stabilize the system on their behalf. White women manage staff, implement policy, absorb conflict, and translate harm into administratively manageable language. This is not a conspiracy. It is a design. White men benefit from being able to appear progressive while maintaining control, from funding diversity initiatives without redistributing power, from championing equity rhetorically while preserving hierarchies materially. They benefit from systems that appear broken but function exactly as intended. And they benefit from the fact that when harm occurs, responsibility is often displaced downward, onto supervisors, directors, teachers, rather than upward, where structural decisions are made. This is how the system reproduces itself across generations. Indigenous men are excluded. Black men are criminalized. Women, especially Indigenous women, Black women, Latina women, Asian women, Pacific Islander women, and immigrant women, are exhausted. White women are positioned as stabilizers. White men remain protected. Understanding this does not require demonizing individual men. It requires seeing masculinity as it operates structurally. White masculinity in early care and education is defined by distance from care and proximity to control. It is defined by the ability to shape systems without being shaped by them. It is defined by benefit without intimacy. And that masculinity depends on others to function. It depends on white women to manage. It depends on women racialized as other to labor. It depends on the erasure of Indigenous and Black men from caregiving authority. Which brings us to responsibility. Men who care about justice in early care and education cannot limit their concern to representation or recruitment. Increasing the number of men in classrooms without dismantling the hierarchy only reproduces it with new faces. What matters is accountability. For white men, that means relinquishing control, not just sharing language. It means redistributing power, funding, and decision-making authority. It means being willing to be implicated in harm rather than protected from it. For men positioned closer to the margins, Indigenous men, Black men, immigrant men, it means reclaiming space that was never rightfully taken and being supported in that reclamation rather than surveilled. And for all of us, it means recognizing that early care and education is not broken. It is revealing itself. We now have enough clarity to return to the women who have carried this system on their backs. Not as victims of an abstract structure, but as leaders navigating a system that has always required extraordinary skill to survive. To understand men's role in early care and education, we also have to understand how the work itself was gendered. In early U.S. schooling, teaching was not automatically women's work. Many early school teachers were men, and teaching could be a stepping stone into ministry, law, or politics. But as public education expanded in the 19th century, teaching, especially the education of young children, was intentionally restructured. Women were recruited into classrooms in large numbers because they could be paid less, because their work could be framed as an extension of motherhood, and because a feminized profession could be more easily controlled. This is not simply cultural. It is economic and political. When a field becomes women's work, the wages fall. When the wages fall, fewer men enter. And then the absence of men is used as evidence that the work is not skilled, because it is assumed that if it were skilled, men would do it. This circular logic is part of how the care economy is governed. So men's absence from the front line is not just personal choice. It is also the outcome of deliberate wage suppression and gender ideology. And that ideology has never been separate from race. Men who enter care, suspicion, surveillance, and role constraint. When men do enter early childhood settings, they often encounter a contradictory set of expectations. They may be celebrated as rare role models, and simultaneously treated as risks. Many programs build informal rules around touch, bathrooming, and comfort care that effectively push men away from the most intimate parts of the job. These rules are often justified as child protection, but they can also function as occupational gatekeeping. Importantly, surveillance is not evenly distributed. Black men, Indigenous men, and immigrant men can face harsher suspicion because racialized stereotypes attach danger to their bodies in ways that do not attach to white men in the same way. This means that get more men in the classroom is not a simple equity strategy. If systems recruit men without changing surveillance, discipline, and power dynamics, they can reproduce harm, especially toward men of color and toward the children those men are expected to control. This brings us back to the central point. The biggest impact men have had on early care and education is not through diapers and lesson plans. It is through policy and money. When we look at who sets reimbursement rates, who designs eligibility rules, who controls licensing frameworks, who decides what counts as quality, who funds pilot programs and then ends them, we are looking at a system that has been shaped primarily from above. And historically, those above positions have been dominated by men, especially white men. Men can remain distant from the daily labor of care and still benefit from the economy care makes possible. That distance shields decision-makers from the consequences of underfunding. If a classroom closes, the educator absorbs the loss. If a provider burns out, the family absorbs the loss. If a system fails, the public calls it a shortage instead of naming it as a governance choice. So what does it mean to talk about men in this system without collapsing into blame or abstraction? It means different things depending on where men sit. For men who hold formal power, funders, policymakers, agency leaders, the task is redistribution. Redistribution of resources, redistribution of decision-making, redistribution of risk. It means funding wages and benefits as core infrastructure, not as a nice-to-have. It means building systems where the people closest to children, primarily women of color and immigrant women, have governing power, not just advisory roles. For men who want to enter frontline early childhood work, the task is solidarity and humility. It means joining a workforce that has been systematically disrespected and refusing the special treatment sometimes offered to men simply for being men. It means learning from the women who have built survival expertise in this field. It means refusing roles that position men as disciplinarians or control when the actual need is care. And for all of us, it means refusing the myth that early care and education is naturally women's work. It is human work. It is skilled work. and it is the foundation of every other part of the economy. When we name men's role clearly, absence from labor, presence in power, we can finally see what must change. Not just who is in the classroom, but who governs the conditions of the classroom. In many feminized professions, men who enter are sometimes fast-tracked into leadership, what researchers have called a glass escalator. That can happen in early childhood too. A man enters a center as a teacher and soon becomes the director, the trainer, or the policy-facing spokesperson. Not because he is more skilled, but because gendered assumptions treat men as natural leaders and women as natural labor. If we recruit men into early childhood without changing pay, power, and governance, we can accidentally reproduce patriarchy inside a field built by women. So the goal is not simply more men. The goal is a transformed system where care labor is respected, compensated, and governed by the people who do it. What would it take for men to show up differently? One answer is straightforward: raise wages and stabilize jobs. When care work pays poverty wages, it will always be treated as optional. And it will always be staffed by the people who have the fewest economic alternatives. But wages alone do not solve governance. We also need power. Men who want to support this field, whether they work in it or not, can ask a simple question. Who is currently absorbing the risk so that I can live my life? Because the economy is not just made of factories and offices. It is made of someone being there when a child cries. It is made of someone noticing when a child is hungry. It is made of someone building language, trust, and regulation every single day.
There's times where kids would come in with ill-fitting shoes, and I'm barely paying bills, off of what I get paid, but I'm gonna get them a pair of shoes. Like they're talking to you. But I think where there's a will, there's a way. And then in childcare, them little gifts are worth all the money in the world.
In the United States, that someone has almost always been a woman. Often a woman of color. Often an immigrant woman. And that is not because men are incapable. It is because systems have been designed so that men do not have to. So the men's section is not a recruitment pitch. It is an accountability mirror. It is asking, if men have been positioned above the system, what will it take for men to be accountable to the system? If men have benefited from the underpricing of care, what will it take for men to fight for care to be fully funded? And if men have been absent from daily caregiving, what will it take for men to share the labor without taking over the leadership? If the system is designed, then change is governance. At this point, the pattern should not feel subtle. Indigenous care was removed. Black care was extracted. Latina care is governed through precarity and gratitude. Asian American and Pacific Islander care is governed through invisibility, through aggregation, through silence, through proximity without power. Immigrant care is governed through legal vulnerability, making conditional belonging a labor policy. White women are positioned as stabilizers, the interface where policy becomes practice, and where practice gets translated back into policy language. And men, especially white men, remain the most distant from the daily labor of care, while staying closest to the levers that decide what care is worth. So if we keep calling this a shortage, we keep missing what's actually happening. This is not just a workforce problem. It's a governance problem. The question is not whether we can find more people willing to do this work. The question is why the system keeps requiring someone to be underpaid, underprotected, and disposable in order for everyone else to function. If we want a different outcome, we have to change what the system rewards. We have to fund care as infrastructure. We have to treat lived expertise as leadership, not as an add-on. We have to move decision-making power toward the people closest to children's bodies and families' lives. Because care has always been here. What's been missing is protection for the caregivers.
I'm going to retire May 31st, and I'll probably be back here reading or doing something for free, volunteer, Because that's, to
And I
me,
think
that's what
it's
I like to do.
something that's
but-
instilled in us from a child up. And that is, you got to have the love in you, okay? To do this.
Care is not separate from justice. Justice is what love looks like in public. Until care is treated as labor, as leadership, and as power, justice remains unfinished. I'm Tim Harper, and this was Waging Love.
Right. So I think that just fundamentally, to me, the future would just be so simple. It's just a valuing of our natural resources, children and families, and the people who are doing that work, valuing them and compensating them and ensuring that their well-being is intact so they can do the important work of developing and ensuring that we have natural resources for the future.